Hello, everybody, and welcome to Some Patches Required, a show where we hope to educate and entertain you on the ever-turbulent games industry. My name's Zach, and I'm one of your hosts.
And as always, my name is Aaron, and I will be your other host.
And I just want to start off the episode by thanking all of our new and our returning listeners. You're all wonderful. We appreciate you. Please make sure to like and subscribe or hit whatever the interaction button is on the platform that you happen to be enjoying or perhaps not enjoying our episode on.
If you're hate listening.
Great. If you're hate listening. It's like spite fucking, but different. All right, well, there goes our monetization. I said fucking in the first minute. Regardless,
oh, no.
Regardless, please hit that interaction button. We appreciate it. Also, leave a comment. Why not? What does it do to you that's negative? Also,
what does it cost?
Lastly, please share this episode with a friend or perhaps a mortal enemy, as we always like to say. It's all the same to us. We appreciate everyone. If you think I'm a desperate woman, that's because I am. Maybe we censor that one out, Aaron. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about the recent battle between platforms like itch.io and Steam, and specifically the battle that they're having with payment processors like Visa and Mastercard. Before we jump into the episode, though, I do have a question for everybody. My question specifically is, do you view the actions of payment processors like Mastercard and Visa as a censorship issue, or is it a reasonable corporate protection? So that's our question. Jumping into the episode.
Yes, indeed. And if you're not already familiar with this story, which has been pretty massive over the last few weeks, then the stuff that we're about to talk about will obviously contextualize that question and give you a little bit of the ammunition you need in order to formulate a well-reasoned thought.
Or at least
as we always do before. Yeah. And I was going to say, we always formulate well-reasoned thoughts before commenting on internet postings. That's just the way the internet works. It's a beautiful place filled with well-reasoned arguments.
That's the only kind of arguments I ever see on the internet, Aaron. So I appreciate that you're calling that out. So to your point too, sometimes we go into way deeper of a dive than we need to on a lot of these topics. So today we're going to try and summarize it a little bit more effectively. This has been an ongoing issue now for, I believe, a little bit over a month. I think a lot of this started at the beginning of July. So we're not going to discuss all of the back and forth. There's a bunch of different people that have already done that already, one of them being Bellular News. Michael actually already has, I think it's like 3 episodes up on this subject. So if you want to check him out, that's absolutely great. Show some love. We're going to be trying to summarize it before getting into our thoughts around specifically Collective Shout a little bit, which will become a relevant name here shortly, and then the payment processor side of things as well.
Yes, indeed. So I suppose would you like to do the honors, or shall I?
Well, I can just jump in. So basically our story starts with an Australian grassroots movement called Collective Shout. They're a self-described grassroots movement. And they specifically went to payment processors like Visa and Mastercard to get adult content games removed from Steam and itch.io. And like I said, this was about a month ago that they started targeting some of these platforms. This was specifically kicked off because there was a game that Aaron and I will not defend called No Mercy that was on, it was mostly Steam. And the interesting thing was that No Mercy actually violated the local legislation of a few of the countries that it was released in. I believe that was specifically the United Kingdom and Australia. And so Collective Shout used this accidental release on Steam's part to go after platforms like Steam and itch.io through payment processors.
Yeah. Essentially, they decided to cut out the middleman and go after the way that money gets funneled through these platforms as a method of trying to coerce the platforms to taking games that do not align with their sort of philosophy off of those platforms. And Collective Shout is dedicated in its own words, being paraphrased by me, to ending sexual violence and sexualization of women and children, and any sort of depictions of violence related to that. It finds hugely objectionable, and I don't think we need to go into too much detail on what specifically No Mercy is at all, or rather was, because it has been just like pulled from sale, I believe, entirely. So if you're interested in figuring out what that game's particular sins are, feel free to incognito that one. But yeah, it is not filled with what I would call defensible content necessarily. It's got some pretty rough stuff, and not really my cup of tea. So in many ways it was low-hanging fruit. But yeah, that's the gist of it. And the runoff effect of this movement by Collective Shout to go after payment processors was that essentially thousands of games got delisted or de-indexed across Steam and itch. Not exactly sure how many specifically were delisted on Steam, but the numbers combined are easily in the thousands, and some of that has to do with the way that itch runs its business, and we'll probably get into that a little bit later. But yeah, there's this massive empty space on these platforms now that people took notice of, and it kicked off kind of an enormous shitstorm.
Yeah, I mean, on itch.io alone, it was 21,000 games that ended up getting delisted. The amount on Steam was a little bit less, and that's ultimately because of the way that Steam categorizes adult games versus itch.io. And it's interesting. We might get into this if it becomes a part of the conversation, but coming out of this, itch is actually redoing a lot of the way that they handle categorizing and tagging games. So if a similar issue to this happens again, they don't have to delist everything. But yeah, exactly what Aaron said. Payment processors went to both Valve, the company that runs Steam, and itch.io, and were basically like, hey, you've got problematic content. You should get rid of that, or we will just not be your payment processor anymore. Actually, I think that there's some interesting updates on some of this as well that are probably most relevant to put in this section. So the biggest one, I think, is really, I found an article from GameIndustry.biz. I believe this was from 4 days ago. I can check that because I do have the power of the internet.
And now it is forever 4 days ago through the power of non-dynamic audio recording.
Yeah, exactly.
Perpetually published 4 days ago.
The wonderful thing is that it just took me to Game Industry. It was August 14th, so exactly 4 days ago. I'm so good. 4 days ago, there was an article on GameIndustry.biz called Not Safe for Work Content. Row continues as Valve confirms PayPal no longer supports Steam purchases in some regions. I did a quick skim of that article, and it's basically saying that one of PayPal's acquiring banks has blocked transactions from Steam, and not just adult transactions, but any game transaction. Specifically, it sounds like it's targeting currencies that are outside of the euro, the pound, the yen, the Australian, Canadian, and US dollar. So that's a lot of different currencies that are being targeted. If you're trying to utilize PayPal, just because a bank basically said, we don't trust Steam to not make our, not put us in a bad light by selling, I guess, adult content that's problematic.
Yeah.
I will say, too, because we'll get into Collective Shout here in a minute, I think one of the important things to mention is there were a few things that Collective Shout like threw at Steam, from saying that they were, promoting misogynistic content, promoting content that was like women getting abused. But perhaps the most problematic claim was that there was child endangerment content on these platforms. And, obviously, at least as far as I know, in most Western countries, and probably globally, if we're being honest, child endangerment content is illegal. And so, of course, payment processors are going to take that incredibly seriously.
Yeah, which stands to reason. I have not found any of that content on Steam, just for what it's worth. So, I mean, I suppose if any of this had been framed out as, pending a review period, like let's do a thorough content review, and once we can confirm that this either is or is not there, we will then move on to the next steps of either reinstating games that don't violate any laws or whatnot, or we'll stop suspending or stop threatening to suspend processing payments on your platform. I think maybe this would have been a little bit less of a big deal, but instead the entire thing snowballed into this massive conversation about censorship of art, censorship of free speech, the role of a payment processor, which is, a business entity, in policing the subjective morality of people who have earned the money that they're trying to spend on things that are not illegal. And yeah, I mean, the entire conversation has been just enormous. And I think I read somewhat recently that everybody's favorite billionaire child, Elon Musk, also has tweeted, and I love still calling it tweeting because it feels like I'm putting it up to Elon Musk. But that particular man-child has thrown his particular brand of shitty hat into the ring as well, encouraging people to sign a petition against these sort of payment processing changes. So it's arrived at that level of sort of cultural saturation as a conversation at large, which I don't know if that is exactly what Collective Shout had intended, and certainly probably not this degree of backlash, but yeah, that's where we are.
Yeah, and I think the last thing to mention here is that I don't believe Itch has changed any of their rules, but Steam has a bunch of different rules that pertain to content getting banned on their platform, and they actually added a 15th rule, which is a result of all of this, which says that content that may violate the rules and standards set forth by Steam's payment processors and related card networks and banks or internet service providers can get banned, or basically there's a potential. And the problem with a lot of this, as you'll come to learn when Aaron and I discuss this in more detail, is that everything is quite vague. They don't provide you with a lot of specific rules so that you can avoid content that would be banned. They kind of expect you to know what is culturally acceptable and what is not culturally acceptable, and then, make content around that. And I think through this discussion, Aaron, we'll probably talk about why there's a lot of gray areas there where you might be talking about content that's not culturally acceptable, but you're not like promoting it, or you're trying to have a discussion around it in a more meaningful way. And so we'll hold off on that discussion, at least for this exact moment. But that's an important thing to mention. And I think the other interesting thing is Steam actually already had rules to ban this kind of problematic content. They actually had 3 rules, and those were found to be, I guess, insufficient by payment processors. So they had to add this incredibly kind of useless 15th rule that is very unclear.
Yeah, and the most concerning thing about the 15th rule is that word may, right? Just because it does sort of position payment processors as the arbiters of what is and is not acceptable for the broader community, which is upsettingly vague. It's a very specific word choice to indicate how vague the actual rules surrounding this change are. And I think that has a lot of people very justifiably worried, myself included, very justifiably worried. And yeah, the kind of ignoring or downplaying of the rules already in place to curtail this sort of content, especially from getting into the hands of, minors, is the sort of stuff that it seems like maybe a court of law would have taken into account, whereas a payment processor worried about their brand image didn't. And so here we are. But yeah, if there's nothing else in the sort of background section that's jumping out to you, do you want to talk about Collective Shout?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can definitely jump into it. And just for some context, I was like, I thought I wrote down the date when all this happened. And I did. It was July 11th. So a little over a month ago is when a lot of this got kicked off. So Collective Shout, we're gonna talk about them now. But I think the wildest thing is they managed to kick all of this off with only 1,067 supporters that were emailing these payment processors. That's what kicked all of this off. Only 1,067 people. I think I may have said 607. If I did, that was wrong.
Yeah, but
1,067. Regardless, both small numbers. And I think that's just absolutely wild. I think the only other thing I would say as we're going into this section, for those that are not particularly aware about Australia is really weird with video games. They're kind of famously known for having issues with this game called Left 4 Dead, which I'm sure a lot of people know if they're listening to this podcast. I feel like it's kind of I don't know if I'd call it a pillar, but it's certainly a game that I think most people know. But Australia,
it's pretty ubiquitous.
Yeah, people in Australia took issue with it, or some groups in Australia took issue with it because of gratuitous use of blood. So I think it was actually banned in Australia because of that. And so Australia's got some weird censorship, community standard kind of stuff that the rest of the world doesn't have. And this feels very much like a continuation of that.
Oh, yeah. Except, you'll read, if you follow gaming news, which if you're listening to this podcast, you probably do, you'll find tons of headlines about X upcoming game being denied ratings by the Australian ratings board. I think there were problems with multiple Saints Row games. Left 4 Dead, which was a zombie game, which you'd expect to be bloody, was apparently too bloody to be released in Australia. And you'll hear a lot about content that has to be cut from games in order to be released in Australia at all. So yeah, Zach is right. Australia is kind of a special case when it comes to what is and is not acceptable. even an appropriately rated game. So yeah, this very much is a continuation of that sort of sentiment, and it makes sense in a lot of ways that Collective Shout would be an Australian group, considering all of that.
Yeah, no, it is very strange by at least US standards when it comes to games, because I feel like here maybe everything is allowed, and then Australia, I wouldn't say nothing's allowed, but it certainly is it's a pickier climate.
It's much more restrictive.
So, we talked a little bit, we talked about it's a grassroots movement, collective action, not Australia. Collective action is a grassroots movement challenging the objectification of women and sexualization of girls in media, advertising, and popular culture. At face value, that's great. Absolutely no issues with any of that. This is not the first time that they have targeted games. One of the, or I guess two of the games that they have targeted for apparently going against, or I guess objectifying women, sexualizing girls, promoting misogynistic,
or portraying violence.
Yeah, portraying violence against women. One of them, kind of unsurprisingly, was Grand Theft Auto. They've gone after and apparently got it pulled from the shelves of both Target and Kmart in Australia, which is kind of wild. And then the other game that they targeted was Detroit Become Human, which is weird to me. I mean, granted, I haven't played the game. Aaron has played the game.
Yes.
And so Aaron, I mean, I think with GTA, it's kind of obvious what the problem they probably had with the game is, which is people tend to go into GTA and then just do really shitty things to the NPCs, whether that be women or men or whatever. I mean, I've certainly seen plenty of content from that game where it's like women getting beat up by the player character, or like abusing sex workers or stuff like that. Like, yes, that is stuff that people like choose to do in the game, but I will say I don't believe the game explicitly tells you to do that. And then I've played more of the Red Dead series than I have played Grand Theft Auto, but you know, largely it's very similar. It's just a Western, right? And I feel like they're kind of progressive games in their own right. I don't know. I've never looked at any of the games and really been like, these are misogynistic and about like screwing over women. Like, yes, the art is kind of sexualized, but I think it's because it's all kind of making fun of America. It's all kind of a satire, at least in GTA.
Yeah. No, I would completely agree. I think taken at face value, Grand Theft Auto is a pretty easy target to point at, right? Because yes, there's the abuse of sex workers issue, which is something that's almost so inherently tied to the image of GTA. Because I remember back, oh God, probably 15 years ago, maybe even longer. No, definitely longer than that. I used to position myself on some sort of moral high ground about what games I would and wouldn't play. And then I would slowly just realize that I was wrong and play that game and realize that it had its own merits and then move on. But I used to know about the fact that in Grand Theft Auto, you can solicit the services of a sex worker and then just go ahead and murder them or beat them up and take your money back. And I found that to be morally objectionable. And I was like, well, that's Grand Theft Auto, because I'd never played the game and I didn't understand what they really were. And then, you know, I ended up playing the games and I went, oh, okay, these games are very, very, very much tongue-in-cheek, right? That's not to say that you can't find that content objectionable or that you should like Grand Theft Auto even though it allows this sort of behavior from the player character, because there are plenty of instances of games that, you know, purport total freedom but don't actually give it to you in regards to, like, you know, like Bethesda games won't let you kill children. Like child NPCs are indestructible,
immortal
beings in those games. Yeah, so I don't think Grand Theft Auto is necessarily intentionally glorifying it, but there is, you know, room for daylight that the argument is to be made that if it's all this, you know, glorious criminal power fantasy for the player character, and part of living that out is being violent towards women and then getting away with it and still making tons of money and being the good guy at the end of the day because you're such a badass, you can argue that. Right. I don't think that's the intention. And I certainly don't think to the, you know, violence in video games argument that pops up every so many years. I certainly don't think that it is overtly contributing to a rise in violence in the real world in any tangible or meaningful way. But I at least understand why people would find that sort of thing more objectionable. Moving to Detroit Become Human, I am completely baffled. That's the sort of game that you are encouraged to play through multiple times in order to see different endings and the outcome of different decisions. And, you know, if you make a mistake during one playthrough, a character can die, meaning their storyline is just cut off from the rest of the game. So I've played through Detroit Become Human probably 3 or 4 different times. And as near as I can figure, the issue that they are raising with the game has to do with a section towards the beginning where you are an android, basically nanny, like a house helper. and you form a bond with this young girl who has an abusive father. And ultimately, spoilers-ish, not really, ultimately your goal is to protect this girl and get her out of the home of the abusive father. It is meant to encourage empathy in the player. It is meant to encourage protective instincts against abuse, and it is meant to highlight the danger and trauma that abuse causes, especially male aggression towards female children. So it is explicitly painting those actions in a negative light, and is at no point encouraging you to do anything other than fight against that exact sort of behavior. So I think it's possible that the people at Collective Shout didn't understand what they were trying to do with that one.
Well, we'll get into it a little bit more when we talk about some of these groups that co-signed some of these actions with them. But Aaron and I were talking when we were prepping for this episode, and I think a lot of the time when you get into the content of child protection, or the context, not content, you end up in this messy place where people are censoring content, claiming it's to protect children, when in reality, it's just to censor things that they think are unsavory. And that doesn't matter whether there's a good message. That doesn't matter if it's beneficial content. The classic example that I brought up to Aaron yesterday was, at least in the United States, I don't know what this looks like elsewhere, is sex ed. Sex ed in the United States is frequently brought under fire, and people are claiming like, oh, they're teaching kids how to have sex, and they're teaching kids to be gay or lesbians or, trans or whatever the fuck. And it's like, no, that's certainly not what's going on. If anything, when I was in sex ed, I cannot say that they implicitly were making me want to have sex. I think if anything, I saw a lot of STDs, if we're being real honest.
Yeah.
I think it's more of like, don't fuck or you'll get STDs. And like, you know what? Is that the best way to handle it? Maybe not, but it's certainly better than like, Jesus won't love you if you copulate. Like
that,
know.
that was my thing that I kept saying is like, the worst possible form of sex ed is don't have sex or Jesus will hate you. Jesus will be super duper mad if you have sex. So please just don't have sex. I understand that you're like every biological imperative in your body is screaming out for you to try and find a way to have sex, but don't, 'cause Jesus. Please don't, because Jesus will be so mad. So we're just not going to tell you how to protect yourselves at all. We're not going to inform you of the actual medical scientific risks, and we're not going to tell you how to avoid those things should you find yourself in a sexual situation. We're just going to say Jesus will be super mad, so don't. And that is a great way to increase the rates of teen pregnancy and a great way to increase the rates of sexually transmitted illnesses.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you look at the outcomes of these things, when groups claim that they're trying to protect children by going after sex ed, okay, well, that's fine. You can have that opinion. You're allowed to have that opinion. But when you look at the data, you're not helping. You're actually actively hurting. So I think that that's a really clear indicator of why it can be problematic to, censor or go after content and claim that it's to protect children. And then, I think Detroit Become Human provides a very clear example of it is not glorifying the content that is abusive, right? Like it is using it in the narrative because sometimes being human and living in the world, or I guess an android, but you know what I mean? Like sometimes being human means comprehending and thinking about these incredibly awful things that can happen. And part of art is to make us comprehend and think about these things in ways that maybe we haven't before. And so if we just say we don't want content that features abuse, even if it's not glorifying it, even if it's trying to use it to tell a narrative, have you learned a lesson? Then that's stupid. That's just dumb. The
Yeah,
issue is
I
the
mean-
intention of the art that has the problematic content. It's not that there is problematic content in the art.
Yeah, if all media, all art from here until the end of time cannot depict anything that anyone finds objectionable for any reason, regardless of context, then we will just stop making stories. I mean, it's over at that point. Because sometimes you do need bad things to happen to your characters in order for them to, go through the story that you're trying to tell. They need to learn something. They need to overcome something. They need to, harness their trauma and use it to motivate change in the world. Or they, you tell a story about revenge because you're trying to show how futile it is. All of these various different things that you're not like, oh, I don't want to encourage my child to become a vengeful fighter. My child will become a vengeful fighter. And it's like, no, that's not the point. If you strip context away from content, then you've lost the ability to have any sort of nuanced exploration of any of the very real, very bad things that actually do happen in life. And in so many ways, as humans, art and media and stories at large are how we contextualize our world. They're how we process things. And yeah, I can't see there being any upside to just throwing the baby out with the bathwater for the sake of being like, no, but abuse is bad. And it's like, yeah, of course it is. That's what the story's about. In order to show how bad it is, sometimes you have to depict that abuse. That's obviously in many cases in regards to a lot of the games that got pulled, specifically No Mercy. That is the most charitable possible interpretation on our part, because a lot of the games we're talking about are not that. But that is still a perfectly valid point worth bringing up.
Well, the one thing I did want to mention that I think is really funny, at least in the context of GTA, is I think it was GTA 5 that they were targeting. And if I remember correctly, GTA 5 has a torture scene in it.
Oh, yes.
With a car battery. And it's like,
yes.
If anything, that's way more objectionable. And you're an active participant in that. Like that, I remember when the game came out, like that was a big deal. But that's not against a woman. That's against a man. And I'm not doing the whole double standard thing or whatever, but like there is objectionable content that you could go after GTA for, and maybe you say like you don't like that it did that. It's like the classic like Call of Duty. Was it Modern Warfare 2 had the scene where you go through an airport shooting civilians? Like there are certainly narrative decisions that people have taken in video games that I can see people not appreciating. But I would offer, at least in the context of the torture scene in GTA, that it probably serves more as a character-defining moment and not to be like, look how fun it is to torture someone with a car battery. I don't know. But, keeping us moving forward and not stuck in GTA land. To your point, Aaron, yeah, most of these games were not safe for work adult games. Michael Bell called them Gooner games specifically. So they were, more porn games, just being completely, just putting it out there. But at the same time, I personally think that relying on societies to make their own legislation around what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable when it comes to adult content is probably the best way to handle censorship, because and sometimes I think societies will fuck up with that and they might be a little bit draconian in terms of what they think. But I think payment processors should not be the ones that dictate what they think is okay and what they think isn't okay. But I will admit that I'm biased. I'm, explicitly generally pro sex work. I think that, sexual content can be artistic. I think that censoring it doesn't really help anybody in the end. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. I think that, there's no getting rid of sex work. There's just making it more safe for everybody. Right? Both in terms of a societal reckoning with being okay with sex work so that there's less stigma, there's less violence against sex workers and all of that stuff, but also in terms of, bringing the occupation into the daylight, allowing it to be regulated so that everybody is much less likely to contract any sort of illness as a result of it. All of these things are things that I think, without having any desire to, solicit the services of a sex worker in any real form. But all of these things are very I was going to say unconservative, but I guess we haven't really touched on that angle of collective shout. But yeah, I mean, I think there, should I talk about that collective shout stuff just very quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think running through who some of the partners or co-signers that they have is useful context.
Yeah, because it does speak to, and again, I'm not explicitly implying anything on the part of collective shout in terms of their stated mission with this particular movement was specifically these violent games, and they've said that they weren't necessarily trying to remove all NSFW games, but, and it's a pretty big but, Zach and I got a little bit curious about collective shout and where their sort of political leanings might be, because we didn't want to assume that just because a bunch of porn games got taken down that they were, a hyper-conservative or Christian-affiliated group or anything like that. So I did some digging and I found a list of co-signers on the initial movement to get, No Mercy and similar games removed. And a quick rundown and bio of each, and I'll keep this extremely brief, but see if you can notice a pattern. You've got the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, which used to be called Morality in Media, a much more overt name, which is an American conservative anti-pornography organization that has also campaigned against same-sex marriage. Phenomenal. Exodus Cry. Either a really bad sequel to an Exodus game or an overt Bible reference, which is an American Christian nonprofit advocacy organization seeking the abolition of the legal commercial sex industry.
Abolition?
So yep, the abolition. So go ahead and destroy the whole thing. And then you have, and I don't even know how to pronounce this one, but it's all intercapped capital, Philia, which is capital F, lowercase I, capital L, lowercase I, capital A, which is a British trans-exclusionary radical feminist group. And then the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Australia, which is an Australian radical feminist and gender-critical, which means trans-exclusionary, non-governmental organization opposing human trafficking, prostitution, and other forms of commercial sex, with ties to American anti-trans far-right women's group, the Women's Declaration International. So, yeah, there is a pretty strong through line of anti-LGBTQ sentimentality, or rather sentiments, as well as anti-porn and anti-sex work. So even if collective shout themselves were not targeting these other NSFW games, it stands to reason that the co-signing organizations would be pretty stoked to see them go.
And I think generally speaking, people, when you're an advocacy group, I think your co-signers do matter to a degree, and you don't choose them lightly. Like, obviously, if you think you're saving women and all these things, I'm sure there's a degree to which you're not picky. But, like, if there was suddenly, like, I'm gonna hit the Nazi button. If there was suddenly, like, a Nazi group that was like, we support women too, we want to co-sign, you might be like,
maybe not.
Or rather, I should say, I would be like,
yeah, I would be like, no.
Yeah, there's just some branding issues.
Yeah, it's like adding too much cumin to a dish. It's all you can taste now.
Yeah.
It's just, this tastes like Nazi. Oh no. But yeah, so that's a little bit of a problem for me, at least, because politically speaking, I find basically all of that. I find all of their stuff objectionable.
Well, I
don't think payment processors should be allowed to process donations to these groups.
Yeah. I mean, That's fair. That is fair.
I'm down with feminism. I like that.
Feminism.
I love feminism. I just don't like trans exclusionary feminism.
Well, I think that, and maybe this should be the last thing on the collective shout front, because I'm looking and we've actually chatted about it quite a bit. And funnily enough, we were like, we're not going to focus on it too much. But I think with the note that you just hit on, that brings up one of the other big concerns that comes up a lot when you're reading these articles, you're listening to videos on this topic, which is that this could be used as a mechanism to go after LGBTQ plus content. Because a lot of the time, because people are idiots, they think that being gay is a sex thing, or being a lesbian is a sex thing. Or, you know what, I'll make it real explicit that it's not a sex thing. Being asexual is a sex thing. Because if you're asexual, you're not fucking. Probably. Well, obviously there's layers to this, but my point is like...
Yeah, there's degrees and whatnot, but...
It's about what, like, who you like and who you don't like. Like, clear example here that a lot of people don't understand, you talking about having a husband or wife as a straight person by a lot of these conservative group standards, they say it's not sexual, but it's no different than having a gay couple in a movie, TV show, whatever. Like, subtle references to what people prefer from, like, I want to kiss your face and be your partner, that's not sexual. But it will get labeled sexual by some of these organizations, and then they'll claim that they want to save children. It'll become this whole song and dance. So that's why this thing is problematic, ultimately, before we jump into the payment processor side of things. But
yeah. I mean, that was going to be my last note as well, which is that a lot of this can be used to basically just erase members of the LGBTQ plus community in a time when that is, at least in America, scarier than it has been in a very long time. And yeah, I don't want to see that happen because, again, like Zach said, even though it is not, being gay is not an NSFW thing, a lot of advocacy groups with this sort of mindset would see LGBTQ plus content, no matter how wholesome, as sexual content, despite the fact that there's no Venn diagram there, right? Like there is no intersection. So yeah, that is of course very concerning, very, very concerning.
As we hurtle into the payment processor side of things, Aaron, I do think it's funny seeing a lot of the pushback against payment processors. I mean, you mentioned Elon Musk. I haven't seen any of those comments, but that doesn't surprise me considering he wants to be the, like, overlord of gamers. But GOG had a freedom to buy campaign that came out, which included 13 not safe for work games that you could just download for free. And they had a statement that said, we believe that if a game is legal and responsibly made, players should be able to enjoy it today and decades from now. It's our statement: when games are delisted today because of discomfort, reviving them tomorrow becomes exponentially harder. I do generally agree with that sentiment that if something gets banned, it's typically harder to get it back than for it to just not get banned, right? So I do generally agree with that sentiment. I will also say, just real quick, there are other organizations that have expressed similar concerns, one of them being IGDA, which has stated that they are very alarmed by the pressures being forced on platforms by payment processors. IGDA is the International Game Developer Association. We actually were in a chapter of it in college. Yuki, which is the developer trade body in the UK, has also expressed concern. And then there was a German game body that also expressed concern, but I can't find the name of it right now. So anyway, point is, a lot of trade bodies are pissed off and think that this is generally bullshit. In fairness, playing devil's advocate, of course they'd say that. Like, they make money on games. Anything that makes the sale of games more difficult is bad for them and their constituents. But, I definitely agree with these trade bodies, generally speaking.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, no, I don't really have any additional notes on that. I agree. I'm very glad to see organizations that large speaking out, especially well-respected organizations that large speaking out from across the globe. And you've got Japan, you've got Germany, you've got the United States, you've got the UK. And a lot of what they're also arguing to some degree is that the ratings system, which I think is an important angle to note on this, we technically already have child protection, imperfect as it may be, child protection, clauses in effect, right? That's why we have ratings boards. And that's why those ratings boards slap a different colored and different numbered thing onto every single game box and also every single game image, when you're trying to buy something from an online storefront, to try and protect children from being exposed unknowingly to content that they should not be exposed to. By which I mean a 9-year-old should not be playing Grand Theft Auto 5.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I said it. That's my opinion. I have long maintained that even though I probably played games I shouldn't, everyone plays games. If you want to play a game that you shouldn't play when you're too young to play it, you're going to find a way to do it. And I know I did it too, but I've long maintained that, like, as a parent, at some point in my future, I am going to be a little bit more hands-on in terms of making sure that the stuff that my kids play is not well beyond their age range, right? And I think a lot of that does come to parents, but a lot of it, is also already taken care of by ratings boards. And Steam, of course, as we discussed, also has protections in place for that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really funny point that you just bring up, because that actually is something that I guess Yuki was looking into or suggesting. Is they're like, payment processors, we already have solved for this issue. And to your point, it may not be perfect, but like, why are we relitigating this? Like, this whole IARC thing, which is basically an international way of handling these ratings between different parts of the world, was partially developed to make it easy for platforms, games to get a rating. Like for example, with the ESRB, if you get a rating of T in the United States, that will get transferred into PEGI and all the different ratings. I don't know all of them, kind of across the world. And it's this more automated process that's supposed to make things easier for game studios, publishers, etc., to get their games rated and accessible in as many places as possible. And, this is a very binary fix for something where maybe a game falls in a bit more of a gray area. You're kind of prescribing a very exact rating to something that isn't always exact. But it's the best option we kind of have right now. And it's a thing that we already have. So it's stupid that payment processors are pretending like that's suddenly not good enough.
Yeah, and the one gray area here that I will touch on very briefly is to say that this is actually what I was alluding to when I mentioned that itch does its business differently than Steam, in that a lot of the games that end up on itch is a very small team. The people who run itch.io is a very small team.
Apparently single digit.
And a lot of the games, yeah, exactly. And so a lot of the games that do end up on there are, tiny solo dev art projects, student projects, horny unrated games. Yes, of course, horny unrated games do make an appearance there. And because they're unrated and to some degree unmoderated, there is a lot more opportunity for legitimately illegal-ish content to appear on those, like, on that platform. So if you're wondering why the huge discrepancy in numbers between itch and the Steam, that would be why, because basically anything NSFW at all, regardless of the degree to which it was NSFW, was just pulled from itch, because they couldn't risk being completely buried by the payment processors at that exact moment. And since then they've started re-indexing a lot of, especially free games, because obviously those can be, those have nothing to do with payment processors. Those can be hosted because there's no fear of payment being rejected by Mastercard specifically, or Stripe or Visa or whatever. But yeah, on the majority of these platforms, and Zach and I even had a whole conversation, which we won't get into probably, about just how sort of robust the filters are on Steam in terms of like making sure that you either do or don't see NSFW and unrated content. Those are pretty robust systems that exist on Steam already to filter out content that people don't want to see or don't want others to see.
Yeah, I mean, I never saw any of the not safe for work content on Steam until I turned that filter off. And also there's been some reporting done. I couldn't find the exact article, but it's referenced in some of the Bellular videos about Steam's approval process and how apparently for adult games, there's some additional scrutiny that's provided because, of course, they want to make sure there's no like child endangerment content. Shout out to Collective Shout that we were talking about earlier for, maybe exaggerating some of the concerns around child endangerment content on some of these platforms. Yeah, no, it's all a mess. And the reality too is, are we going to start censoring books now too? Because how many books, I've heard so much about smut novels recently. You disgusting women out there reading your disgusting fairy smut. I'm joking, to clarify, but there's been a lot of like smut novels that have been pretty popular. I think probably because of book talk. I don't know. I hear these things secondhand, and some of those have some questionable content. We're talking about like incestuous kind of stuff, problematic kind of things that, some of us may not love. Not necessarily illegal, but, similar to this whole Steam thing. And as far as I know, you can buy all that using Mastercard and Visa. Like, they're not jumping in to prevent you from buying these novels. You brought up the interesting example of Game of Thrones, which has incest in it and problematic sex scenes and all of this kind of stuff. Are they going to suddenly just ban Game of Thrones? Absolutely not. That's not going to happen. And so it's all so dumb and double standard-y and ultimately serves really nobody in the end, unless you just don't want there to be sexual content up for sale. Those are truly the people that win, the people that don't want sexual content up for sale. And, yes, in the case of No Mercy, it was kind of, at least in my opinion, incredibly gross, the content that was in that game. It was a very low bar to have to hit and say this game is kind of shitty. But just because there is an example of a game being kind of shitty and awful does not mean that all adult games are as inherently problematic to the fabric of society. And, it's dumb. It's dumb.
Yeah. Ultimately, I mean, I have many thoughts on this because, yeah, I completely agree, right? Like, Game of Thrones as a book series was enormously popular before it became a record-breaking global phenomenon of a TV show, which just has an insane amount of stuff that would be objectionable to just about anybody. I mean, really, because the amount of non-consensual interactions that people have, the amount of violence perpetrated against men and women and children. I mean, hell, there's an entire like online community cheering for the death of one particular Game of Thrones child. And if you've watched the show, you probably know who I'm talking about. The book, the first book, like the inciting incident within the first few chapters is a child getting kicked out of a window and becoming a paraplegic as a result. These are all things that I guess are, I mean, I'm sure there was plenty of blowback to Game of Thrones during its time, but at no point was Mastercard the one being like, well, this isn't art, this is filth. No, HBO, we can't allow it from you any longer. That's my Mastercard voice. And it's kind of wild, and it's another one of those situations where, again, video games sort of become the scapegoat media for it, probably because of the interactivity. But yeah, I don't know. I think that level of censorship being applied across the board would winnow down available media to a shockingly sparse set of, basically Veggie Tales at this point. And I don't think that's the media landscape anyone wants to get into. And I don't know. We're at the point now where we're either going to go long or we're going to go into sort of final thoughts. Well, do you have a strong preference?
I mean, I think my final thought here is I think this really puts into perspective, at least for the United States and a lot of very similar countries, this weird relationship that we have with sexuality and wanting to censor it versus violence. Because, well, in the United States, we're very weirdly prudish about, well, at the same time that we're not. It's this weird dichotomy, if we're being completely honest, but we're way more likely to censor something for being sexual, air quotes, than we are for violence. I've always thought that's weird because I think violence is probably the more problematic of the two things to be shown. And that's what I'm thinking about here at the end is it really shows to me that there's not groups going after, maybe more explicit violent content in games. And instead, there's this fixation on sex. And certainly there are groups that go after violence in video games. We've all heard video games getting blamed for the violence issue that the United States has and not gun control and all the other things that are way more effectual or effective. But I don't know. That's what I'm thinking about in these moments before we close off is how dumb all of this really is. From a society standard of what we think is okay and what we think isn't okay. And again, to clarify, No Mercy is a bad, I don't have anything positive to say about this game. And that's kind of one of the interesting things is I think that's a way to weaponize against people kind of doing what we're doing is saying, oh, well, you support the content in No Mercy. And it's no, dude, I just don't think you should go around banning all not safe for work content because it's not like it's all the same. Or even not safe for work content. You don't need to ban fucking Detroit Become Human for being abuse is bad, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. I think to not repeat what you said, I think in this situation, this is obviously a case of myopic morality run amok, I think is what I'm going to go with, where context is of course lost, especially in the case of a Detroit Become Human or, other games that got delisted because of NSFW bits like mouthwashing or, other, non-problematic games that have something to say but utilize challenging themes to do so. So the lack of understanding of context is concerning. The potential for LGBTQ plus erasure is concerning. The idea of censorship coming from a payment processor is also deeply concerning to me. And I think I'm going to spend 1 minute talking about that just because it'll probably be my closing thought, which is governments are imperfect. This is, of course, news to nobody. And especially in America right now, our government is very imperfect. And there are a lot of things that you should not trust a government to do or to do well. And you can easily make the argument, and probably justifiably, that censorship in general is bad, right? And that having a governing body telling you that this cannot be seen or this cannot be done in art is a massive free speech problem. Because as long as there is no traceable harm being done in the real world, then the art itself is not inherently causing a problem. It exists, it may be objectionable, but if there is no harm, then it should not necessarily, in my opinion, be deemed illegal. Again, it is entirely up to you whether you want to support that content's existence or not. For a game like No Mercy especially, I will go ahead and sit myself down in the not category. The same way that Nazis are allowed to post on social media, even though I think they can go all fuck themselves straight into hell. Take that, Nazis. Someone finally said it. But, you know, those issues aside, I think the most concerning thing for me here is that governments exist to legislate. In theory, the payment processors don't. And I definitely see it as a worrying sign that companies like Visa, Mastercard, Stripe, and others are the arbiters of what does and does not contain artistic value. They are the ones deciding what is and is not objectionable content. And they are ultimately having a more substantial impact over censorship than even a government. Because, I mean, heavy-handed government censorship would be its own problem, but we didn't even let it get there. We just let giant companies that control our digital money tell us what is and is not okay to spend our money on. And that, I think, is very, very concerning and something worth rallying against. And yeah, it sucks to sort of occasionally sound like you're defending some of this really shitty content, but I'm not. I'm just saying that the trend is worrying, and not to borrow a book from the page of fallacies, you know, in regards to the slippery slope, but within this one context, it didn't take long for a slippery slope to turn into a sheer-faced cliff, right? Especially in the case of Itch. And depending on what the implications of Steam's Rule 15 will be, that's where we're going. And yeah, it's a concerning trend, definitely something to keep an eye on. And yeah, despite the fact that we were a little bit late to this story, in some regards, I think we are still like very, very much in the middle of it, and very possibly at the beginning of this fight if it, you know, progresses and continues long term.
Yeah, I mean, the whole answer to how we're going to handle this from a platform perspective hasn't really been touched on, particularly. So it'll be interesting to see where everything ends up ultimately. But with that being said, we're all out of time for this episode. So we'll probably have to go ahead and get to our thank yous.
Indeed. May I start?
You may.
Aha! Well, I would like very much to thank Beach Girl for our wonderful intro and outro music, because that is, of course, that is what they provided us at the beginning of this 4+ year journey that we've been on now. And they do also, for your listening pleasure, have a fine library of music that you can procure at any sort of digital storefront or streaming platform. So check them out on Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud, Bandcamp. Just about wherever you want to find your digital music, you should be able to find Beach Girl there, and I encourage you to do so because it's pretty good stuff.
And I'd like to say that you should check out Mosscat Market. Mosscat Market is who helped us with a lot of our original illustrations and cover art, and is just a generally cool person and friend of the show. So make sure to check out Mosscat Market, and that is their handle on both Etsy and on Instagram. So thanks for hopefully supporting Mosscat Market and Beach Girl. We appreciate when you appreciate the people that help us. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And until next time, Goodbye.
Indeed.
If you think I'm a desperate woman, that's because I am.